Welcome to the Happier and Healthier podcast. I'm your host, Maria Marlowe, and this is a place where we don't rely on good luck or good genes for our health and happiness, but rather we create it with our thoughts and our actions each and every single day. Each week, I'll bring you a thought or a guest that will help you live your happiest and healthiest life. Are you ready? Welcome back to the Happier and Healthier podcast. Today's guest is holistic psychiatrist Dr. Kelly Brogan, MD. She was trained traditionally at NYU, Cornell, and MIT, but as we'll discuss, after years of doing things the traditional way, she realized there was a better way. So now she practices a more holistic version of psychiatry in which she addresses the root cause of mental disorders through diet and lifestyle changes instead of medications. She's written a number of books, including the New York Times bestselling book, A Mind of Your Own, the children's book, A Time for Rain, and she was co-editor of the landmark textbook, Integrative Therapies for Depression. Today, she's here to discuss her latest book, Own Yourself, the surprising path beyond depression, anxiety, and fatigue to reclaiming your authenticity, vitality, and freedom. Before we get started, check out these brands that make the Happier and Healthier podcast possible. Are you interested in turning your passion for health and wellness into a career that helps hundreds, thousands, or even millions of people live healthier? If so, consider becoming a holistic health coach through the Institute for Integrative Nutrition, the original and top health coach certification program. I studied there in 2012, and it completely changed my career path and life. I went from an uninspiring job in finance to an exciting, fulfilling, and rewarding career as a full-time health coach. The program is offered as a 1-year or accelerated 6-month course, and it teaches you a mix of nutrition, coaching, and business. They have some of the top teachers, including Dr. Walter Willett, who was the chair of Harvard's nutrition department for 26 years, Dr. Marion Nestle, a professor at NYU and author of one of my favorite books, Food Politics, Dr. Mark Hyman, who is the medical director at the Cleveland Clinic's Center for Functional Medicine, Dr. Andrew Weil, Deepak Chopra, Gabby Bernstein, and so many more. Millions of people are suffering from diet-related illnesses, and I truly believe the world needs more health coaches. That's why I've teamed up with IIN to offer an incredible opportunity to make studying there even easier. You'll get $1,500 off tuition, plus one-on-one mentoring with me, plus you'll be added to my private Facebook mentorship group where you can connect with other students and grads and also practice with them. To get your 3 bonuses, simply email me at maria@mariamarlowe.com. That's MariaMarlowe.com with the subject IIN, and I'll personally send you back the email that will allow you to get all of these amazing bonuses. If you feel called to explore or start a career in health and wellness, definitely reach out. Dr. Brogan, thanks for being here.
Total pleasure.
So in traditional psychiatry, one of the main tools in helping those with mental disorders is through medication. However, although that you're traditionally trained, you decided to put down your prescription pad in 2010. So why? What happened, and why do you prefer other methods for treating mental disorders?
Yeah, it's not so much a preference as an evolution of my understanding. It's an important bit of context that, as you said, I was very much a dyed-in-the-wool believer in pill-based management of not just psychiatric symptoms and syndromes, but also all illnesses. I thought that it was kind of a war that needed to be won, and that this was the most powerful arsenal we could access. And I believed so much in this model that I specialized in prescribing to pregnant and breastfeeding women, and was one of the first 300 so-called reproductive psychiatrists who were offering women a version of the scientific literature that would defend their continued prescription of all kinds of medications, from lithium to Zoloft to Klonopin, you name it. And so it really wasn't until I had a lived experience of dissonance. And I think that's the only way we ever change our mind. I was diagnosed with Hashimoto's thyroiditis about 9 months after my first pregnancy. And I just had this strange, I don't know, voice come up inside me that said, well, I don't want to take a prescription for the rest of my life. Like somehow it was fine for my patients, but when I was in the hot seat, I was not interested. And I was so negligent around self-care at that time in my life. I don't know if I was just like worried I would never remember to take it, or just like would be just kind of a pain. I don't think that I had any bigger goals other than trying to weasel my way out of having to take a prescription for the rest of my life. And so I knew what conventional medicine had to offer. I could have written my own prescription for that matter. And I went to a naturopath in downtown Manhattan, and she recommended she was very intellectual. She wasn't like wafting sage everywhere or, chanting over me or anything like that. Not that naturopaths typically do that these days, but in my world, in my mental scape, they did. And I was uncomfortable with the concept, but I knew that it was my only chance at an escape hatch. And so she was very academic, she is Nicole Egenberger, and very intellectual. And she really helped me to see that there is a scientific basis for this other way, for this other approach. So because of that, that bridge is very important for me. And because of that, I did make these changes, and I watched in black and white my antibodies and TSH come into the normal range in a matter of months. And not only that, but I also had, experiences of my body, like I went from pooping once a month to having like totally normal digestive function, probably for the first time in my entire life. I didn't even know, doctors don't know, we're not trained about normative health. So I didn't even know that was not normative. If for the most part, if you're asking a patient about their bowel movements, you're like, are you having any? Like that's pretty much like the conventional medicine question. And because I had that lived, felt experience that I couldn't reconcile with the information I had accrued up until that point, which largely stated that, lifestyle change and specifically dietary change was like a nice window dressing, but had nothing to do with real treatment. And certainly, I had only ever understood that autoimmune conditions were chronic lifetime illnesses. It was interesting because my first response was actually rage. I was really angry, and righteously so. I felt betrayed. And that is a little window into the kind of parental relationship that I and so many have with the allopathic system. It's like the parent who's going to unfailingly care for you in total honesty, clarity, and purity, and always be there when you need them to tell you exactly what you need to do. And, I had dedicated the previous decade of my life, blood, sweat, tears, $200,000 of debt, to learning, what I began to understand was just a very small sliver of the available science around health and healing. And so it was at that point that somebody gave me a book called Anatomy of an Epidemic by investigative journalist Robert Whitaker. I never would have cracked open this book had I not had that experience, that fire ignited in my belly. And I read it cover to cover. I still remember crying on the subway when I finished it, because I knew that it was like a house of cards crumbling. I knew that everything had to change or I would never be able to sleep at night. And what that book helped me to understand was that if you go outside of industry published literature, you learn a very different story about psychiatric medications. And it was because of that book that I never started a patient on a prescription medication again, and haven't since. So I really had a lot of exposure, maybe more than, I don't know, maybe anyone, I'm not sure, at least with a public platform the world over, to what the natural history of the resolution of quote unquote mental illness, and I will put that in quotes and we can discuss why if you'd like, but I've come to understand what it looks like to move beyond those labels, move beyond those medications. And it really does require a fierce commitment to a new level of consciousness and a new paradigm of health. And I have to say that it's one that feels so much better to inhabit,
Yeah. Well, let's break that down a little bit. Why are you putting mental disorders, mental health in quotes?
So, there's the evidence-based answer I'll give you, and then there's the spiritual answer that I'll also offer. On an evidence basis, it's very important to recognize that psychiatrists do not use any objective testing right? So we don't have blood tests, we don't have brain scans, we don't have EEGs, we don't have a single physiologic or biologic metric that has been validated for the purposes of diagnosis. Okay, so how do you get a disease label in psychiatry? You have something between a 7-minute and a 2-hour conversation with, a credentialed clinician who uses their own subjective discretion to choose one of these diagnoses. Now, these diagnoses live in an ever-expanding Bible called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. Who decides what's in that book? Well, it's a round table of individuals that has only recently included women, 70% of whom are industry funded. That means that they take money directly from the pharmaceutical industry. And so if they're human, then they're going to be vulnerable to the incentives around the creation of illness in service of medication-based treatment standards and ultimate profits, right? So if you know all of that, then you have a very, different perspective about what's going on. But if you don't know all of that, then you might think that these are, disease entities that have been codified and verified and have genetic origins. The countless tax dollars have been put towards trying to identify the genetic basis for every single one of these diagnoses that have come up completely and totally empty-handed. And, what I found to be the most penetrant meme, even among my colleagues, I have to say, I can't blame them, because if you haven't, dedicated your life to, debunking some of these myths, then you might very easily fall into the land of the meme. But the most penetrant one is that depression is a chemical imbalance, right? Because I think it's like psychiatrists not even trying to explain the biological mechanism behind schizophrenia or OCD or, bipolar disorder. It's like all sorts of hand waving. But when it comes to depression, this idea is very penetrant that there is a serotonin deficiency and it's a chemical imbalance broadly. And that's what I thought. That's what I told patients. And then I said, well, that's how the medications work. They're fixing this imbalance. Well, lo and behold, when I went back to the books, I found, do we not have evidence of an imbalance in 6 decades of searching for it? But actually what's happening with these medications is they're creating a new normal. So they themselves are creating an imbalance. Now, that imbalance may be adaptive for you. You may like it. In the same way that when you drink, a pint of vodka, you may dig it. It may have effects on you that are desirable for you at a given moment in your life. But we're not pretending that in drinking that you're resolving an alcohol deficiency or an alcohol imbalance. It's a new chemical state that you may or may not classify as adaptive. And so it's even embedded in the language, right? It's called an antidepressant, right? So engaging in that warfare against the disease state is already communicated through even the name of the category of medication. And so we've sort of been swept up in the tide of our desire for this magic pill, because we've all participated in this. We cannot just point a finger at the pharmaceutical industry. And we've been swept up into this tide, and we've forgotten to ask if there's actually any valid science behind it, or if this is just what the Cochrane database would call consensus medicine. So if we know that these are not valid biological states, they don't follow the criteria for diseases in any meaningful way, then we might ask what it is to receive a diagnosis. Like, why would anyone accept one if they knew that, right?
Right. Well, I'd love your opinion on this, because I think this whole idea of depression being a chemical imbalance is so widely ingrained in popular culture, in media. Can you talk a little bit about why this is the case? If you're saying you go back to the books, it's not actually true, this hasn't been validated, but why is this happening?
Advertising. Marketing. It's a very successful and penetrant marketing campaign. We are one of 3 countries in the entire world that allows pharmaceutical companies to speak directly to consumers about their biology without any controls for the veracity of those claims. And this is not, my expose. There have been many pioneering renegades before me whose work I have simply curated. People like Joanna Moncrief, Joseph Lacasse, Peter Bregan, and David Healy. So I just simply had to look at the science that they presented in order to convince myself, because I was pretty shocked. I paid attention in medical school, I read the available literature, but when something is accepted to this extent, it's not the kind of thing you're going to be incentivized to go back and read about the origin story, right? That's just kind of like, human.
Yeah, you had a quote in your book, something about a man can not understand something if his salary depends on him understanding
yes, it's a
it.
famous quote. Yes, and that's true across industries, right? It's true, and it's just human nature that we have allegiances and we have agendas and we have biases, and that's why good science controls or makes an effort to control for those. But we've come a long way from good science, in part because there aren't those checks and balances in place, because the fox is guarding the hen house, because, the heads of the FDA, CDC, and major pharmaceutical companies are all the same people. The FDA requires 2 positive studies to license a new drug, with no stipulation as to how many other studies you can conduct until you get those 2, right? So most people don't know that. Even one of my very scholarly colleagues was like, because I quote that in the book, and she's like, well, I don't know that that's accurate. And I provided her the evidence from the FDA's website that it is. So it's almost unbelievable until you understand they never said they're here for our well-being. And maybe we're at a point in our cultural evolution where it's time for us to adult, right? It's time for us to grow up, start thinking for ourselves, start making our own decisions, and stop outsourcing that, right? Stop relying on these external power structures and authorities to do the research for us, right? And tell a tale that serves their reality, because we're all living in each our own reality, right? There is as many truths as there are individuals. But that's, far easier said than done, because so many of us are Stockholm syndromed around this dependent relationship on the conventional allopathic structure. And, that's where I was heading in terms of like the spiritual relevance of these diagnoses, because my observation and listening to, numbers of individuals who've been captured by the Guild of Psychiatry, they all tell me that they carried this kind of secret shame around feeling sick and broken, and that something was fundamentally wrong with them. Like they had it from childhood. And that when they were finally in that, doctor's office, whether it was a internist or a psychiatrist, or even a therapist who offered a diagnostic label, when they finally got that first label, they often described to me that they felt validated, right? They felt seen. It's almost like confirmation of what they were hiding, which is that something is indeed wrong with them, right? Here's the evidence. It even has an ICD-10 code, and it's a real problem that society recognizes. And in fact, there's nothing you can do about it. You're probably born with it, and you can just go ahead and manage it with this medication, which is a means of actually conferring a sense of control, which confers a sense of safety that perhaps they never felt in their lives, right? So what is it to actually ask someone to leave that label behind? It's a courageous journey of heroic proportions. And that's in no small part why I wrote this book, so that I could showcase these individuals who have walked this path, because the fact that they have walked it means that it is more possible, I believe, for the rest of us to consider doing so, or at least to feel inside whether that's something that has a magnetism, whether that's something that calls us toward it.
Yeah, and I think that current generation is definitely more open to challenging this notion that the doctor is God. But I know my parents' generation and before, they really, if a doctor says it, it must be true. And of course, doctors play a very important role and can be very helpful, but we do have to be our own doctor, and we do have to question things. I think just the idea of questioning things is sometimes very foreign to people. They're just so used to taking whatever is told to them, from even like me growing up in like a Catholic religious household. I just had to take, whatever they told me. Or you were talking about thinking of like allopathic medicine, like your parents, like we all grow up thinking our parents are like gods and they're perfect and everything is great about them. And then one day you realize, actually, they're fallible humans, they're not perfect. And it's just like very earth-shattering at that time. So I can imagine that people who have been diagnosed and who are using their diagnosis as a crutch, it can be scary even to like think about just looking at it in a different way. And like, for example, in your book, you talk about the nocebo effect, which was actually quite interesting. Can you explain what that is?
Yeah, and I'll just make one comment too about what you were just referencing, because I found myself sort of reflecting on the almost reflexive statement that doctors play a role. I've come to wonder if in the psychiatric population, there isn't a way out necessarily through a doctor. And I don't know if that's because when you are diagnosed with diabetes, your understanding is, oh, something's wrong with my pancreas, right? When you are diagnosed with a mental illness, the fundamental understanding is, again, that confirmation that something is wrong with me, that my emotional reality is at odds with what is acceptable, not only to me, but to others around me and perhaps society at large. So that's why I've found that through, I've had a one-on-one practice for over a decade, and I've come to now see that the outcomes through my one-on-one practice are actually the worst of any available to me, right? And the most powerful outcomes are through the doctorless community, where I don't interact with anyone, but I host it, right? So it's the belief system that I endorse, certainly. And with my credentials and with whatever, having been in the belly of the beast, I know that that's a relevant bridge for many people. But nonetheless, the outcomes out of our online program, many of which are featured in the book, were doctorless outcomes, right? And so I don't know if for these particular individuals, doing it yourself is actually a part of the magic. And it's a part of shifting from the sort of like neurobiological signature of dependency, helplessness, and ultimately fear and victimization into the signature on a nervous system level of personal power, personal authority, and a sense of deep okayness and trust in a process that is inherently complex and cannot be micromanaged, right? Can only be rededicated to through the belief that it is happening exactly as it's meant to happen for you. That is the regenerative signature. And that's why we've had outcomes that defy even my own ability to recognize that these are possible. Graves' disease and lupus and migraines and asthma and allergies, multiple chemical sensitivity, and you name it, of the psychiatric labels, sometimes in months. That's not happened in my private practice. The outcomes in my private practice took years and a lot of working with how to kind of help these women get out of the nest, like out of that dependent dynamic. So, I wonder about that. I'm studying all of this now because it's unfolding before our eyes. And I do think, to your question, that the role of belief, sometimes I just refer to it loosely as mindset, is really not to be overestimated. It is not what I thought it was in my training, which is like as characterized by the placebo effect, right? So it's just kind of this like nuisance you have to control for and make sure that you're not tricking people. And that's why they think they're getting better. Like that's literally how we're trained to think about it. But there is some incredible literature, most of which has been pioneered by Irving Kirsch, who is arguably the placebo effect expert the world over. He's written books about it and published some very important psychiatric literature on the role of belief in antidepressant outcomes, but not just belief like, oh, I'm so excited to take my Prozac, I know it's going to work, but what he calls the active placebo effect, which is what happens, again, on a psychoneuroimmunologic level, when you start to have the side effects that you've been told are related to the treatment, right? Dry mouth, stomach ache, headache, constipation. When you start to have those side effects, even if they are from a cardiac medication that has nothing to do with an antidepressant, but you have associated them with an effective treatment, you will have the same level of outcome as if you took, the antidepressant itself. So this active placebo effect helps us to understand the role of belief as perpetuated even by and through the physical experience of side effects in these medications, which is really a very important nuance because most of these medications have been compared to sugar pills. So it's very obvious when a patient is in the treatment arm because of those side effects, right? And so when he controlled for that, he found there was no difference. And, anytime I talk about this, there's, in a lecture hall or something, seminar, there's always somebody who's like, well, I don't care what you say. I know that Prozac saved my life, or my aunt is only alive because of Zoloft. And, that's wonderful. why are you at this lecture? But whatever, that's another question, but that's wonderful. However, it's important for us to understand that it may not be for the reasons that we are being told by our doctors. Why? Because that will help us engage informed consent. It will help us to weigh the seeming benefits and our understanding of the efficacy against the adverse effects, right? Because if you can achieve this simply through personal choice, commitment, and belief, and maybe a nice body of science, to support it, then is there a safer, maybe even more effective way? When it comes to the opposite of that, the nocebo effect, it's really interesting. Favorite studies are in that category, and I'll mention one of them is a Prozac study, right? So those individuals who might have raised their hand in one of my lectures and said, well, this worked for me, I don't care. And they took a cohort of those individuals who were treated to remission on Prozac, right? So the Prozac worked for them. Then they told them that they were going to be randomized to either their same dose of Prozac, same treatment continuing, or a sugar pill. And at the randomization point, both groups began to become statistically significantly depressed. So Mary took her 40 milligrams on Monday, enters the study. She's still taking her 40 milligrams, but her fear that she might be in the sugar pill group and might have lost her medication induces a relapse. She's still taking the chemical. So that is the power of the story that you are telling yourself. It can literally co-opt the chemistry of what you are exposing your biology to and commandeer it. So this is important for us to bear in mind when we engage treatment paradigms.
Yeah, I mean, that's incredible, right? I mean, just thinking about that, it's kind of like, wow. But I think there's probably times in all of our lives where we've experienced something similar, where we thought something and we were so sure about something, and then we started acting as if it had already happened and, drove ourselves crazy, got, so stressed and anxiety and all these things. And then, it wasn't even true, right? It was just a story that we made up and it wasn't actually the truth. So I know personally in my life, I've definitely experienced that multiple times. So I can see how this nocebo effect is very, very powerful.
Absolutely. I mean, the example that I use just to tie in the physiology is like if you're walking down an alleyway, let's say like in the Bronx or something in New York, and you're by yourself and you're a woman, and you hear like these rapid footsteps coming up behind you, there's going to be a whole biological cascade, racing heart and sweating and shortness of breath and stomach tightening. And your, imagination is going to feed you all sorts of images of catastrophic things that are about to happen. And then if you, from those footsteps, hear your friend's voice calling your name, right? Maybe even like laughing, all of that is going to reverse. Right. And the only thing that has happened, I mean, you might even laugh yourself just to let off some of that, fight or flight chemistry. The only thing that has happened is you've told yourself a different story about what's going on. So that is how we have to shift out of the fight or flight state that the conventional medical system really keeps you arrested in. It's through your own storying about what's going on and cultivating a reflex of curiosity. Right. So instead of saying, it's like a change in tone, right? So instead of saying like, why is this happening to me? It becomes like, why is this happening to me? It's like an inquiry, right? It's like, oh, wow, this is interesting, because they're, if not for the, again, psychospiritual reasons, then consider the neurologic reasons to engage in that kind of a mindset.
Right. Well, this is a great time to bring up the subject of childhood trauma and how that fits in to our health problems, mental disorders. Where does that piece come in, even with autoimmune disease?
So in my training, because, I trained at NYU Bellevue, which is very biologically focused program. And I know not all of them are this way. And there are analytic programs that are very interested in the childhood narrative. But let's be real. Nobody is recommending psychoanalysis as first-line intervention for schizophrenia or suicidal major depression or psychotic bipolar disorder. So it still had its nice little compartment for the worried well, So in my training, the idea of childhood trauma, it was really only given a a nod, right? But never really incorporated. Why? Because what are you going to do about it? Right? Like, it is what it is. It already happened if it happened. And we're dealing with the symptoms here and now and how to manage and suppress them. So it's part of the, you don't really matter in your own health treatment paradigm under the allopathic umbrella. And it's not out of malice. It's just the nature of that system. The individual's narrative is not relevant because you are part of a scaled system of slicing and dicing and enumerating, elements of human biology, and it's a mix and match from that point. So I really didn't have an appreciation for the role of childhood trauma or adverse experience in adult health until I began to see that 100% of the women that I worked with in my practice over the years, identified as having had traumatic experiences, either chronic or acute, in their childhood. And these ranged, right, from like a very difficult, conversation with their mom, to being shamed by a teacher, to, heinous experiences of violent incest. And so, I came to see, wow, this spectrum is important. But the person who had that difficult experience with their teacher, their nervous system, their vagus impairment, right? So their parasympathetic nervous system may be on par with that person who experienced this, these egregious acts of violence. And then I came to expand the spectrum even more to understand that, in fact, if you had a relationship with your parents, which I think includes, frankly, 100% of us, where you developed an understanding of what their ideal child looked like. What did that child do in school? What did they do extracurricularly? How did they behave at home? How did they speak, right? What kinds of things did they do to other children or not do to other children? If you had that understanding develop early on, probably as early as even 2 or 3, for most of us, then you already were living in a state of contingent self-esteem, right? So valuing yourself based on your ability to approximate that ideal child. And you're living in an environment of conditional love, right? So could it be possible that the experience of incubating our nervous systems in settings that ranged from very basic conditional love all the way to acute violence, that we all have to find a way to heal from this, that it actually includes all of us, right? And of course, we're going to manifest it differently. But I've had, patients who've simply had verbal abuse experiences or neglect experiences who seem to have more soothing of their nervous system to do, again, than those patients who I would have maybe in my, inpatient unit days documented as having significant child abuse history. So what that leaves us with is really the task of what many are calling reparenting or self-parenting, this transition from our childlike programming and associated defenses into an understanding of who we are, our essential nature as adults who have the capacity finally to be the parent to ourselves that we never had, that unconditionally present, accepting, compassionate, forgiving, nurturing person. We have the opportunity to be that for ourselves. And actually, it's the only way it works. Because just talk to somebody who's in an intense romantic relationship and they'll let you know that it's not going to come from a partner. It's not going to come from your parents. So time to give up on that, right? Hopefully when you get into your 30s, if not sooner. And importantly, if you're a parent yourself, it's not ever meant to come from your kids. That's just perpetuating the same problem, right? Like sometimes I think the most valuable yield of the work that I've done personally on myself, in these past couple of years is that I'm getting to a point of really engaging a practice as a mother of allowing my daughters to be who they are. Period. It's the hardest work of my lifetime to simply allow them to have emotions, to have opinions and preferences, and for me to self-soothe when I don't like it. Okay. And that seems simple, but it's really advanced level psychology.
Yeah, so that was going to be my next question is, it sounds like it's pretty much inevitable. We're all going to have some sort of childhood trauma, right? Because there is this wide spectrum. But as parents, or for any parents listening, how do you minimize that trauma or, as much as possible? So you mentioned a couple things. Is there anything else as a parent people should be doing to really let their kids
Yeah.
grow up? Yeah.
So that's where my bias, because, there are a lot of people in this zeitgeist speaking to this issue, and I'm so grateful for it. Like, this is a normative conversation we're having now, like people understand this, they're getting it. And we're understanding that there's no way around engaging this level of healing. Most of us, I mean, I'm not sure politicians do for the most part, or those, pulling triggers and pushing detonating buttons. But the rest of us are confronted with, I think, this crossroads, right? Where we recognize we have an awareness that we are wearing a mask. Like, we understand we've curated a version of who we are so that we feel okay-ish, at least in control somewhat of the story of who we are. And then we're hiding all sorts of other stuff. Some of that other stuff, by the way, could be how extraordinary you are, that you've put in a catacomb. Some of it, more commonly, like my experience, is like fearfulness, laziness, incompetence, manipulativeness. Like, for me to recognize that I have all those traits would not have allowed me to keep my mask on. So I had to double down on that mask, or I had to let it fall. And there was a point years ago at this stage where I decided, you know what, I'm committed to dropping the mask. And I know this is going to be the hardest work of my lifetime, and I'm going in. Right? So it's it's a different kind of journey, and it takes a lot of vulnerability. But then the side effect, one of my best friends said the other day, the side effect of vulnerability is love. It's so true. All you need is one experience of being real and owning your shit for somebody in your life who loves you to say, wow, I feel better knowing that you've experienced this, and for you to have shared it with me. Right? So, this journey is an epic one. It's the hero's journey. And my bias is that it starts with very basic, as the Zen say, like chopping wood, carrying water, that until and if you have healed your nervous system, brought yourself into autonomic balance in a very basic way, it can take 1 month. Please just give yourself this gift before you start navigating the realm of, triggers and real-time relationships and looking under stones, that you thought you'd never peer under. The ways in which that is going to bring up emotions that are going to terrify you and literally make you imagine that they might kill you is so significant that why wouldn't you drain your bucket first, right, before you start filling it up with all this stuff? So I'm a big believer in physical healing coming first before the psychospiritual journey, if you have that luxury. Because there is a reality to weathering the storm of an emotional state, right? It's energy in motion. It's emotion is a real, it's like something like a volcano or a tornado. And all you actually have to do is let it turn, let it swirl, and then it's going to alchemize and change and transform. But until you have your first experience of that, you're not going to believe it. And you're going to take the bait that actually it's going to kill you and you need it to stop immediately, right? So if you can grow your nervous system and you can grow your witness consciousness, right? So that adult eye that's always watching, no matter what's going on down below, that is saying, it's fine. It's more than fine. It's by design. Everything that's happening, first of all, you're creating it. And second of all, you're going to make exquisite sense out of it very soon. So it's all good, right? So that voice is what you can cultivate through meditation, through detox, through nutrition. I believe that, right?
Yeah. Let's talk about that. What are some of the most impactful dietary and lifestyle changes that you think are the most helpful?
So in this realm, I've become very interested in neuroinflammation, because if we're trying to rebalance the autonomic nervous system, which is the part of your nervous system that you don't have direct conscious control over until you do. So the part that regulates your heart rate and your breathing, the minimization of the inflammatory response or rebalancing of it is actually quite easy to do. Sometimes you can do it in a matter of weeks. And so that involves controlling for what I call addictive foods and beverages. So including things like coffee and alcohol, processed sugar, and also the ways in which processed flour can masquerade as sugar itself, looking at the potential role of specifically wheat and dairy. And I've amassed a lot of the literature that suggests that these play a very particular role in mood, cognition, and behavior. So obviously they're yanking on your nervous system through the gut-brain connection. And because so many of us who have strayed from our optimal health in this way are struggling with, gut dysfunction or gut imbalance, or what's often termed dysbiosis, which interestingly etymologically means wrong living. So that's all that's going on, right? Doesn't mean you are terminally sick or you have some gene that's acting up. It just means there's a right way for you to live, and you're going to figure out what that is. I also advocate for restricting what are called resistant starches, which are ultimately reintroduced, but which have a very powerful, what's called prebiotic effect on the microbial ecosystem of the gut. So in my nutritional approach, it's a basic ancestral diet, but that's sort of like one of the twists, I guess, in it that seems to help.
Yeah. Yeah, no, inflammation, we know, it's pretty well known now that inflammation is the root cause of so many chronic illnesses and disease, not just mental, not just the brain fog. And I know in my practice, one of the most common complaints a lot of women have is that they're tired all the time and they have this brain fog. And often people don't even realize how foggy their brain is and how much they're forgetting things until they actually cut the gluten out and cut the dairy out. And then they're like, oh my God, it's like a veil has been lifted and I can think again. I have a memory again. So yeah, food is just really some of the most powerful medicine that we have. Now, what about like some lifestyle? Is there any lifestyle habits or techniques, things that you think people should be doing on a regular basis?
Yeah, in my approach, the month-long protocol has very, very specific instructions in a couple of domains around diet, of course, as we mentioned, around contemplative practice, so cultivating and balancing that stress response in just a couple of minutes a day. And then detox, right, which is obviously a huge category and includes everything ranging from the pesticides in your food to the perchlorate from your dry cleaner to the fluoride in your water to the, the glyphosate raining down in your backyard. It's a daunting list. And now we have growing awareness around EMF and 5G networks, and it can really feel like the sky is falling, right? But there are these very basic steps. Of course, some of it's just conscious consumerism, right? Like buy this detergent instead of that one next to it. It's just cultivation of awareness, and the awareness always grows. Like just today before this interview, I hardwired my laptop for the first time, right? So I've been in this world for 10 years. I finally got to the point where I was ready to no longer work with Wi-Fi, right? But so it's like when you're ready, you're ready. That's an ongoing sort of practice and cultivation.
So is there no Wi-Fi in your office now? That's amazing.
No. Yeah, I know. It's so simple. And it's actually something I learned from my own membership. So talk about the value of community. We created a community called Vital Life Project as a companion for this book. And it's been in, beta iteration for the past couple of months. And we had a whole month where we talked about, Wi-Fi and EMF, and I brought in experts and all this stuff. And not only did I learn myself more about, because it's ever evolving, right? Especially that topic. But I felt because other people were doing it, that it was more accessible to me to prioritize. So I'm a huge, huge believer that our power of choice is really about prioritization. It's about your loving attention on something. And so if I came at this, thinking about the 5G arrays, down the street from me and how all of this is going on, and, from fear, I probably wouldn't have taken personal action because I myself been too involved on the social activism layer of it. And I don't know, I've seen that happen over and over and over again. But if it's just kind of like fun and interesting and like, oh, let me try this, then it's just another way to take back that little bit of power, and it feels good. It feels affirming. I feel proud of myself that I took that step. And that's ultimately how these steps should feel. They should induce in you a sense of pride that doesn't come from following the childhood programs of this is how to get love, right? So the wall of diplomas or the best-selling book or the successful practice. Turns out, I don't know if you'd agree, but for most of us, it's very fleeting, right? It's the hungry ghost of the achievement program that we're running that says, oh, that's how I'll finally feel loved. It's not true. Self-care, right? Turning towards the mystery of you is actually, and really showing it acceptance and ultimately a kind of relational mastery, right? Like I am in control of this body. I know how it works. I know its language, right? And I can also spare other people from having to take that on. I've got it. I've got me, you know, that actually is where these little points of pride come in. And it's like surprising, but I think I'm not alone in observing that.
No, for sure. So I have two more questions for you. One, we've talked a lot about medication specifically for mental disorders, but I know in your book you also said that you're pretty much no medications across the board. Is that right?
So listen, this is about fundamental beliefs, and everyone has to find their own way. That's why I am a big, big, big proponent first of informed consent. When you know, let's say, the version of the story that the conventional paradigm tells you, and then maybe the version I tell you or someone else who's questioning whether that's the whole story. When you know the potential for overpromising in terms of benefits, you know the untold story of adverse effects, and then you know that in lifestyle medicine or so-called alternative medical options, whether that's homeopathy or shamanism or Ayurveda or Chinese medicine or whatever it might be, that there is a capacity for transforming illness into vitality that simply isn't offered through the conventional model, then and only then can you make a choice that's right for you. Because you may hear all that and you may still be like, not for me. Trust me, I've seen that happen many times over, especially after I published my first book. And I thought, well, obviously nobody's ever going to take an antidepressant if they read this book. Not true, right? For some people, it still feels right. It still makes sense. That's great. That's why we live, hopefully, continue to live in a world where each of our truths can coexist, right? For me personally, I live a non-pharmaceutical lifestyle and I raise, my children that way. Not, yes, because of the adverse effects, but really it's more ontological. It's more, that I believe the body expresses purposefully, right? I believe that there is deep meaning in symptoms. And I find I take great interest in exploring that and, engaging in the investigative process of what could this be about, Could this sore throat be about that argument I had, with my friend last Tuesday? In my rubric, and there are models like German New Medicine or even Louise Hay's work that help to really create a template for you to begin that exploration of what might be at the root. Like, how are my symptoms? How is my body a transducing technology for my emotional and potentially even spiritual layers of consciousness that I don't yet have direct access to? And perhaps I will after I do that investigative work. So in that, sort of like orientation, taking a medication to manage symptoms just doesn't make any sense. So it's not that it's like bad or good or whatever. It just doesn't fit. Like, it doesn't have a role. And so that, I think, is the most sustainable shift from the paradigm versus just kind of running from it and hoping for the best.
Yeah. No, I think that's really well said. And I just want to share an experience I had because I'm definitely on the no medication, as much as possible, and really had stayed away from all pharmaceuticals. Like, I won't even take a Tylenol or an Advil, none of that. And about a year ago, I got a UTI and I was like, okay, no, I'm going to take, the cranberry pills, the homeopathic medication, going to get rid of it. Fine. Took it, didn't go away. Took some other, natural medications under, a naturopath, a couple different naturopaths, and kept trying things, D-mannose, this, that, the other thing. And I kept checking it and it was not going away. So this literally, I was so determined not to take antibiotics because I've also made myself like deathly afraid of them, having taken so many.
Right. So talk about nocebo effect, right?
Yeah, exactly. Right. So growing up, I took so many antibiotics all the time. I was always sick and I had so many gut issues, after that as a result. And I was like, the past 10 years, I was like, I've avoided antibiotics like the plague. And so, this UTI, going to conventional doctors, they were scaring me that it was going to go to my kidneys.
Kidneys, as they always say. Yeah.
I mean, the thing persisted. I'm not even lying. It was for a whole year. Like, I just got rid of it a month ago because I finally broke down. I was like, okay, I'm just going to take the antibiotic. And I really didn't want to do it. I was so scared. I was like, it's going to ruin my gut, all of this. And then I was like, you know what? And it's not even going to work because I left the infection so long, So I'm like totally driving myself crazy. Took them. It went away. and I took a bunch of probiotics and was fine. So I
Yeah.
just want to share that because, I was feeling guilty for taking the antibiotic because I was like, how can I take this? Like, this goes
Yeah.
against everything that I believe in.
And that's why, so in the book, I provide in one of the appendices a natural medicine toolkit. And it's basically like the things that I recommend stocking, supplement wise, many of which you mentioned, honestly, so that you feel there's something you can do. But what I believe is more effective, and I mentioned it already once, but is an inquiry-based template like German New Medicine. So in German New Medicine, not to get into too much of the detail, but until and if you resolve the emotional conflict, which is normally around a boundary violation, the symptoms can persist, right? But they play a specific role. And in fact, German New Medicine argues that it's in the resolution phases of the conflict that your bacteria are helping to reestablish the integrity of the tissue. So it's like pointing at the bacteria as the problem. It's not the first time we've done that in conventional medicine. Like think about statins and cholesterol, for example, as being, the target versus just a bystander of inflammatory endothelium. So it just reframes everything, and it helps you to guide your attention towards really supporting the resolution of this psychic injury, because that's the belief. So that's sometimes where and how, like the green pharmacy route, which trust me, I engaged for many, 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 many years before I discovered things like German New Medicine. I'm not sure it's equipped to work because it's like, it's supporting the body, and I certainly don't think it's harmful. But the route, the psychic route, like the emotional route, potentially hasn't been addressed because who's aware of connecting those dots, right? And so that's why I really relish the recruitment of these other kinds of models. And listen, I'm not like a devotee of German New Medicine. I certainly think it has its limitations, but it's where I turn. I mean, I have a book behind me that's like this big that I look up all my friends' symptoms in, the first time they have something, because it can point their attention in the direction of focus on emotional healing. And my perspective is that that's really at the root, that these biological programs, these symptoms are actually for a reason, because of what through our thoughts and feelings we've told our brain we need on a bodily level. And of course, the effacement of the urethra makes more room for urine to come out. And that is how animalistically we mark territory. So it all begins to sort of makes sense. And it also reframes, bacteria and even fungi and other, microbes as being helpers rather than part of the problem. But, listen, I think we can do ourselves a great disservice through self-judgment, and
Yeah.
that's talk about a healing process. I mean, I think that that's going to be something I'm working on for the rest of my life. So you gave yourself an opportunity, if nothing else, to see that some of that's still there, right? Like that you have still the capacity to, as Don Miguel Ruiz Jr. would say, self-domesticate, which is like to punish yourself. No one else has to do it, right? No one else had to say anything. You were the one, you had that. So if nothing else, that was a powerful opportunity to see, like, what, in the future, I can engage with more compassion and self-forgiveness if I do make choices that seem right for me at the moment, that maybe some other part of me is saying, well, that's not good. You're doing it wrong, and how can we interact with that voice? Because ultimately that is a part of what keeps us trapped.
Right. Well, one last question that I like to ask everyone on this show. If you can leave our listeners with just one tip or piece of advice to live a happier and healthier life, what would that be?
I think it's probably that, okay, so if you've listened to this conversation thus far, there's either going to be a yes or a no that you can feel in your body to this kind of discourse, right? And so what I would say is, if that little teeny fire is lit, like try to find a way to put a glass globe around it so that it can grow. That I think a lot of us have concern about surrounding ourselves with like-minded people and having our social media feeds all say the same thing, and like something's wrong with that. I actually think it's a very important time in human history to create the conditions for the incubation of and protection of these nascent little sparks that are very, very important indicator of what is to come for you in terms of authenticity. And that it's important to really create almost something like an echo chamber. I didn't used to think that because I was like a debater, and I thought, well, let's all have it out. But I actually think even on a nervous system level, really surrounding yourself with like minds is important. and with material that affirms your intuition.
Very well said. Well, thank you so much for being on the show. For anyone interested, definitely check out Dr. Brogan's book, Own Yourself. It's available on Amazon and wherever books are sold. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.